Martha.
Bismillah Rahman Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, ever merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all. Welcome to tonight's lecture organized by the UK Talim Department. As is our tradition, we begin all our programs with a recitation from the Holy Quran, and I call on our brother Burak Beg Sahib to give us a recitation from the portion of the Holy Quran and its translation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى ووجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث. The English translation. In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful. By the growing brightness of the forenoon, and by the night when it comes still, thy Lord has not forsaken thee, nor is he displeased with thee. Surely, every hour that follows is better for thee than the one that precedes. And thy Lord will soon give thee, and thou wilt be well pleased. Did he not find thee an orphan, and give thee shelter? And he found thee wandering in search for him, and guided thee unto himself. And he found thee in want, and enriched thee. So the orphan oppress not, and him who seeks thy help chide not, and thy bounty of thy Lord proclaim. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah, Brother Beksad, for a good reading. Tonight, we are in for a topic that is quite relevant to human history from all ages, the topic of money and trade. Tonight, we are blessed to have Dr. Mohammed Iqbal Sahib, who is a producer and host of Living History on Voice of Islam. He will be giving us a lecture on the history of money and trade and the rise and fall of empires. Dr. Sahib, Jazakallah.
Jazakallah and assalamu alaikum to our listeners, brothers and sisters. I hope you found some of the talks I've done previously useful. Today, I'm going to make you the first audience to hopefully hear a little bit about the history of money and trade. This is something we set out in the Living History team to produce a 7-part series on the history of money and trade. And we're on to our last 2 programs of the 7-part series in terms of recording and completing, and soon, inshallah, in the summer. it'll be launched on the Voice of Islam radio, and you can listen to it on SoundCloud as well. So I'm going to, at least this is a visual medium, so try to give you a visual presentation rather than what you will hear on the radio, but I do hope that you will listen to it in a lot more detail, because that's about 7-8 hours you're going to listen to, whereas today I'm going to cover this in about 45 minutes. So Shakil, if you could please give us the first opening slide, and then I can make a start, and I'll leave about 10-15 minutes for question answer sessions, please. So most of you hopefully will be following what's going on in the news in terms of the current crisis the world is facing. And a lot of it is based around the concept of trade, and therefore associated with money at national level, and of course at the level of the ordinary punter and their pocket. Most of us are familiar with money in some form or another. The sort of traditional representation of money has been the US dollar on the global stage, but prior to that it was the British pound. And of course there are associated metal coins with those as well. All nations have some sort of paper money and coins associated with their nation. But I suppose we should go back to the basics and ask, how did we attach a value to these pieces of paper, whether it's the dollar or the rupee or whatever it is, or the yuan for the Chinese? How did money come into the lives of human beings? And what role did money play in the rise and fall of nations and empires? So these are some of the questions that we're going to try to answer in this series that we produced. Shakil, if I could have the next slide. So these basically show the 7-part program. I don't know how large it is on your viewing screens, but these are the 7 programs that we're making. So just to give a bit more detailed sort of a setting, and then I'll explain what each chapter contains and go through those in a bit more detail. Throughout the ages, many empires have risen and fallen, and some of these have been covered in our living history programs in detail, those of you who listen regularly. One of the greatest empires the world saw was the Roman Empire, which stretched from Europe to North Africa and much of the Middle East. And from small beginnings, this empire grew to an enormous size, one of the biggest the Mediterranean and the European world had seen, stretching across to parts of Asia as well. This empire had a belief that their gods or their god had given them the right to conquer others and have dominion over other lands. And that's been part and parcel of human history with other empires. Whilst nation builders and great emperors concentrate on gaining more territory, great religious figures like Jesus of Nazareth were more interested in winning hearts and souls for the sake of God and a better afterlife. And this deep belief led a great teacher like Jesus to advise his fellow Jews when he said, and this is from Mark 12, verse 17, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Now, Jesus believed that the Romans were much more interested in money and collection of taxes from their subjects, including the Jews, and it was important that the Jews or Israelites should focus on winning the pleasure of God Almighty. For Jesus, religion and the need for spiritual development was more important than wealth, power, and nationhood. Now, in our modern world, there is a common saying, especially in the West, that money makes the world go round. The phrase basically means that everything in this world would stop without money, and to some extent, this statement is true. Without money, you cannot afford a shelter on your head, buy the food to survive, or go from point A to point B. So in this series of programs, in part 1, which we call Genesis in the beginning, with cows and crops to coin trade, we're going to look at the origins of early trade and money, where we used our crops and animals and other bits and pieces as early human settlers. Then in part 2, which I'm going to share with you briefly as well, called The Rise of the Great Eurasian Empires, we'll be looking at the way gold and silver took center stage in trade and conquest that shaped many of the large and influential empires, from the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great to the Athenian and Greek empires of Alexander the Great, and all the way to the Roman Empire, and of course coming up to the current age later on. We will also look at the crucial developments that took place across India around the early times, especially the rise of the great Mauryan Empire and the unification of China under Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor who unified China, and then the great Han Dynasty that followed this unification. In part 3 of this series, called Worlds of Conquerors, Prophets and Reformers, we will look at the role of religion played in shaping trade between nations and empires and the relationships between them. In particular, we will look at the interaction between the Romans and the Jewish people, leading to the rise of Christianity. How did people deal with loyalty to God and loyalty to the emperor? We will also look at the impact of Islam on the world and what difference it made to the relation between the ruler and the ruled. And in part 4 of this series, which we entitled Islam, a Bridge Between East and West, we will look at how the Muslims during the golden age of Islam picked up new ideas from India, China, and the Greeks, and how they refined many of these and passed them on to Europe. Following the fragmentation of the Abbasid Muslim Empire, of course, the Caliphate, the Muslim world split into great empires of the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughal empires, and these have been covered in detail in living history as well. And these empires acted as the bridges between the East and the West. During the Mughal rule of Aurangzeb, in fact, India became the biggest economy of the world, overtaking China for the first time. We will also look at how China became the most powerful land and sea power during the Yuan Mongol rule, and then the Ming dynasties, which were incredible dynasties. In part 5, we will look at the making of a European world, and in part 6, we will look at the clash between capitalism and communism, bringing us into the modern world. And then finally, in the last part, part 7, we will look at the making of a new world. And we will provide a summary description of these programs as we move on. So Shakil, if I could have the next slide, please. So let's start from the beginning. As I said, the Genesis. Humankind, you know from history programs, settled around river basins. And we had some of the great early civilizations around the Tigris, Euphrates, the Mesopotamian, and the Chinese around the Yangtze River and the Yellow River as well. And then, of course, around the Nile, we had the great civilizations as well. So these were river-based civilizations, stolen studies that started to develop. And I've covered these in a lot of detail in the living history programs. As these societies settled, they started, rather than being hunter-gatherers and people moving around, they settled down into farming communities. And one of the first things they learned to do was harvest crops. So you had your, barley and wheat and a number of other major crops that they managed to grow and feed themselves and distribute to the others as well. And equally, over time, they learned how to do animal husbandry as well. So whether it's goats, sheep, etc., and cows and associated animals. And some of these animals, of course, were used for farming as well, like the bull, very strong creature. And many of these became revered so highly that they became part of religious belief as well. So if you take the cow in Hinduism and the bull in Middle Eastern religions, they were major figures. So these animals had great value attached to them because what they could do for the society as well. And then, of course, the development of the horse would made the whole expansion of empires possible as well. So the horse had a great value as well. So exchanges were done in a simplified way over time by people. So the concept of coins and money was to happen much later on. So early on, for example, you'd be wanting to say barter a cow for somebody who's selling some bananas. But obviously the value of the cow is a lot more, and the chap who only had a few bananas could not exchange a few bananas. Therefore, you'd have to have some other things. And you can see the complexity of those. Either they'd need a lot more bananas, and the other chap couldn't give a part of a cow, etc. So there had to be another exchange medium based on trust, and that's how commodities started developing. Things like salt, things like shells, and metals, and even barley. How much barley you could exchange for a cow, for example, as well. So, and the amount of barley given was described as a shekel in Mesopotamia, and that became the first currency. So this is how commodity value was sort of developed, or commodity money was developed. But there were still problems in this area, because there was not easy access, and in terms of divisibility there was a problem. So later on, mankind moved on to using metals. Now metals were available quite early on. Copper was available around 9000 BC. So copper usage became quite common, both in terms of jewelry and household items, as well as exchange, and to some extent in armaments as well. But it was the addition of tin to copper that really made a big difference, because that gave you bronze, and bronze weapons certainly were much tougher and much more valuable, and therefore for defense and conquering as well. So the value of bronze went up markedly. And then, of course, iron was much tougher than these. And the first civilizations to develop iron were the Hittites, and then obviously the Achaemenid Persians as well, who went on to become mighty rulers as well. So copper, or the metal trade, was much better because you could divide it much more easier rather than moving around cows and herds and barley and things like that. So the metals became very common. But in time, there were enough precious metals now being made available, such as silver and gold, and the value therefore became attached to those more, whereas the iron, etc., was used for weaponry. So gold has always remained to be one of the great sort of commodities and values, and even now gold bartering goes across the world, and gold standards, etc. Recently you've seen the attachment of the ruble to gold, giving it a very high value, whereas the dollar is not attached to the gold. And in the money markets, people talk about buying gold rather than equities and this and that. So it's amazing how it's retained its value. But silver was much more accessible and available. So earlier on, silver was used in the form of hack silver, which was large pieces of silver that could be traded, etc., across different tribes, different nations, etc. So one of the reasons why gold and silver became optimum form of money is because of their properties that are just as important today as they were 5,000-6,000 years ago. And these are, one, as an easy medium of exchange. Gold and silver store a large amount of value in a small area, small piece. They became a unit of account, and these are important. A fixed weight of gold and silver had the same value whether you were in Egypt, China, or Europe. So, especially pure gold. They were durable, that they didn't waste away. The same gold that the Egyptians were using trade 5,000 years ago is still here with us today. You could divide it, it was divisible. You can break it up into pieces, and therefore, much more flexibility in doing deals, etc. It was portable. You couldn't carry lots of barrels of oil even. Even the oil became important, but gold you can, and silver you can. And so, it was fungible. That pure gold and silver are the same wherever they're found on the planet. So there's nothing about being cheated out with that. And most importantly, it was a great store of value. And later on, of course, we have the fiat currencies, which I will go into later. So the pieces of gold and silver that ancient civilization were using were odd sizes, though. I mean, the Chinese even had, various forms of weapons, shapes, plows, etc., which they exchanged as value. But you couldn't carry a load of swords or plows or whatever for value. So this is where you needed to get to the next development, and that is to get a coin, some form of coins which you can carry. And that really went to Anatolia and in Lydia. Lydia is part of current-day Turkey on the Aegean coast. And it was the king Elytes of Lydia, who was around 560 BCE, who introduced the first coin. And then his successor, King Croesus of Lydia, is associated really as the sort of person who introduced coinage in a big way. And he was around 560 to 546. In fact, Croesus became so well known across the whole of Mediterranean that his name, was slipped into all sorts of things. His wealth grew, his nation grew in strength, and one of the mistakes he made was to go on and take on Cyrus the Great in a clash of nations. And of course, Cyrus the Great was great for a reason, and he, basically destroyed the Lydian nation and took over all the wealth, all the coins, and whatever. And the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, was one of the great. In fact, it was the superpower from the great ancient nations, because you had the Babylonians and the Assyrians and Egyptians and the Hittites. But really, there was no comparison to the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Again, I've done a detailed program on that as well. And Cyrus the Great was a magnanimous figure, respected in the Holy Quran and in the Bible and by the Greeks. And the Jews in a big way as well, because of the liberator function they achieved. So he was indeed the King of Kings, as it is said in those titles. Can I have the next slide, Shakir? So that was the start of coinage and coins. And whilst coinage was widely now available in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East, it's fair to say the Chinese also had their versions of coins, and some say it may have been before 600 BCE, although we still have to confirm that with archaeological evidence, etc., maybe by 900 BCE. And they used copper quite a lot, whereas the Middle Eastern people had moved to silver and gold, but copper was still a big feature, and although gold and silver access was there in China as well. And one of the things which the Chinese did with their coins is they made a square in the middle so that they could easily thread things as well. So that was quite an important feature as well. So the Chinese civilization, as I said, developed around the river Yangtze and the Yellow River, and during the Bronze Age, the Shang Dynasty, which was around 1500 BC to about 1600 BC, carried the great Bronze Age civilization of China forward. And then the Zhao Dynasty, which was from 1046 to 246 BCE, was probably the greatest ancient civilization, ruled for over 800 years, the longest period. And they were around the similar time to the great Greeks in the Mediterranean as well, both in terms of their administration and their thinkers like Confucius and many others as well, who were comparable to the Greek great thinkers of the time. Around 221 BC, of course, you had the great unification of China, and that really made China a power from 2,000 years ago to the current age as well, with the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, who's, again, I've covered in the 4-part series on China, amazing figure. Although he only lasted 15 years, but he did an incredible amount to develop China, even greater in terms of roads and administration and development than the Roman Empire of the time as well. But the Han Dynasty took over after 35 years of the Qin Dynasty, and they lasted 400 years. And of course, they were the first golden age of China. And again, in the various programs I've done for you, you can see in detail what they did. But they introduced coinage in a big way, using copper, tin, lead, bronze, brass, iron, and all sorts of things. And of course, there was gold and silver there as well. And, coins were really used to develop that civilization and that economy, which became throughout human history, it's been the biggest economy apart from Aurangzeb's time when India took over. So, and even the Romans, they admired the Chinese silks and things. So even from that time. And then, of course, you have the Indian contribution as well. Around sort of 322 BCE, you had the Mauryan Empire, and Chandragupta Maurya founded the empire, but it was his grandson, Ashoka the Great, who expanded the empire all the way up to Afghanistan and down to Madras. And I think Aurangzeb and Ashoka's empire were probably fairly similar, but perhaps Ashoka's might have been slightly bigger. And again, their economy represented, over 32 to 35% of the world economy at that stage, one of the great economies of the world, and they had their own coinage, etc. as well. So coming back to the Middle East, as I say, the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great was the superpower of the time. But the great traders were the Phoenicians, who were based around Lebanon, Syria, etc. And they traded all over the Mediterranean. And from the biblical writers to the Greeks hated them because they were so successful. But they didn't want to fight. They just wanted to trade, and they set up trading posts. And one of the most important trading posts they set up was around Carthage, North Africa, which I'll come to much later on why that became important. So during the Persian Empire, the Persian dialect became the great currency of the world as well, which remained for many, many centuries. Let's now move on to the real battle between the East and the West. And the first real East and West battle happened between the Persians and the Greeks. The Persians, of course, were the greatest empire. And as they were expanding towards the borders of the Aegean and towards the Greeks, there were certain settlements of Greeks, and Cyrus the Great wanted them to help control some of the rebellions. But the Greek mainlanders, rather than doing that, actually sided with the Greeks living there to be rebellious all the time. And once Cyrus has passed away, Darius, his son, next successor, got annoyed with this and saw that there was treachery involved from the Greeks and invaded Greece. And you've seen the film 300 and all the other nonsense that goes from Hollywood with it. But clearly there was a massive army from Persia, which was the superpower at the time. And, they basically eventually defeated the Greeks. But there was this 300 indeed Spartans that really did put up a good fight to slow the progress of the Persians and took over large parts of Greece. But they weren't done then. And guess what saved the Greeks eventually? It was their silver mines. They were lucky that during that time, apart from building Greek unity to fight the Persians, they needed to find somehow means of supporting their war and rebellion. And so the great mines of Laurion, which are in Attica, near Athens, were probably one of the greatest finds of silver mines. And from that silver, the Greeks built a massive armada of ships to take on the Persians. And of course, at the Battle of Salamis, the Greeks finally defeated the Persians. And in this second time invasion of the Persians, they had to go away because of this massive defeat. However, as power gets to destroy mines and other places as well, the Athenian, the Spartans, which was one form of Greeks, one city-state of the Greeks, and Athens, which was another state, whilst they had joined to fight the Persians, once the Persians had been defeated on Greek soil and expelled, they started fighting themselves, and that was the Peloponnesian Wars. And this is greatly recorded by Xenophon, one of the great historians of Greece as well. He was Athenian, and Xenophon. This is Xenophon recorded the history for the Persians and the Greek fight, and Thucydides was the other historian who wrote the Peloponnesian Wars, and there he described how when one power rises through great wealth and accumulation, another one gets jealous, and you have this fight. And you can see the repeat of that throughout our history in humanity, how that happens. So Sparta obviously got jealous that they did most of the fighting to get rid of the Persians. And now the Athenians were beginning to dominate the whole of Greece. So this Peloponnesian War lasted for quite a while, and it really destroyed the Greeks internally. And guess what? At the end of it, the Persians became the big controllers of what was happening in Greece. So ultimately, the Persians, through diplomacy and control, actually still won the Persian-Greek wars in some respects by influencing what was happening on the Greek land. But as the Athenians and the Spartans fought with each other, of course, from Macedonia, which was a really backyard state in Greece, you had Philip having great ambitions, who was the father of Alexander the Great. And after Philip passed away, Alexander the Great, of course, consolidated his hold on Greece, but then took over the whole of the Persian Empire and went up to the Indus and so much more over a 10-year period. So, and again, he adopted most of the Persian ways and the Persian currency and economic models because he admired Cyrus and Darius as well. But of course, after Alexander died, then the empire split up into three different parts. Again, I've covered that in my different programs. So whilst the Greeks were damaging themselves in lots of different ways, there was another small power that was growing in the Mediterranean, and that was from the city of Rome. Started off as a very small city-state, really, ignored by many others. And whilst Rome was growing, of course, the Greeks were declining. But the city of Carthage, which the Phoenicians had set up, was the big power base of the Mediterranean at that stage. And Rome was really subservient to Carthage. But around the islands of Sicily and a few others, there were confrontations, and thus you had the next sort of Thucydides trap, where you had a rising power and a dominant power, and the clash happened. So you had the Punic Wars. And the Punic Wars lasted from 264 to 146 BCE. And in the first one, I think arrogance of the Carthaginians got to them because they thought they would annihilate the Romans, but the Romans managed to defeat them at sea, and the strength of the Carthaginians was sea power. And after that, of course, they had a bit of a break, and the Romans gained really in power and confidence. And then you had the father of Hannibal, the great general, establishing his own little Carthaginian state in Spain, which they controlled in the old days. But there was an agreement between the Romans and Carthaginians that in Spain they wouldn't go beyond a certain point. But of course, as with everything, there was a clash. There was the next Punic War, Punic War II. And in that one this time, Hannibal decided to march all the way through the Alps with his herd of elephants and massive army, and would have absolutely annihilated Rome if it wasn't for the greedy senators back in Carthage who refused to send him armaments and backup, etc. And of course, without that, he couldn't keep the war going. So he had to return all the way back to Carthage. And of course, by this time, the Roman generals had learned all his tricks and all his strategies and whatever, and they applied those to defeat him in Carthage. And of course, he went on the run, and there was a very sad end. And Carthage was absolutely destroyed during the Third Punic War. And that's what happens. The victor chooses what to do. And they were merciless, the Romans, in what they did to Carthage. And I think even the Tunisians now can't forget that. But of course, Rome became a great republic, and that republic lasted, for a long time. And for nearly 500 years, I think it lasted, and it ended with the establishment of the Roman Empire, which is a very separate part of Roman history. So, and that's obviously was instigated by Julius Caesar, who marched from Gaul, having got fed up with the English giving him trouble. He got fed up with the senators in Rome creating problems and being greedy, etc. Marched on to Rome, fought with Pompey, the other general who he defeated, and then he fought with his friend Antony as well, and took over Egypt, and you know the story from there. But the Roman Empire was established through him, and it was an amazing empire. from his, I think his adopted son, Augustus, took over really, and he established the legacy of the Roman Empire and becoming the emperor. And he was an interesting fellow. I'll just read something he wrote when he was passing away. Say, I am mortal and have mortal obligations to fulfill. I shall be content if it is thought that I have discharged the duties of a prince. He wasn't pompous, but he had a great vision for Rome, and that certainly developed early on up to Tiberius. But after Tiberius, some of the emperors like Caligula and Nero, and they were absolutely mad. Nero, for example, Caligula, his name was actually Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but nicknamed Caligula. He was tyrannical, and he preferred entertainments where public executions and torture took place. He exhibited his wife as nakedly as himself in front of his friends and wanted to marry his sister. Debauchery and craziness. And Nero was maybe not as bad, but it was pretty awful, especially to the early Christians. Many emperors arose in the Roman Empire who continued to engage in foreign wars and expansion. And of course, you need money. And, you need lots of gold, lots of silver, and a lot of loot and bread and all that. So, but to keep the populace happy, they developed these gladiatorial rings and what became known as bread and circus for entertainment. Sometimes even using wild animals to tear people to shreds, another time gladiators fighting them. And the biggest ring that was created was during Trajan's time, around 70 AD, the Colosseum, which took nearly 50 to 80,000 spectators. And again, you had gladiators fighting each other and animals tearing others to bits, and it was quite terrible. So to support this enormous empire and this level of debauchery and fun and whatever, the Romans used one of the world's most developed coinage systems. Coins of brass, bronze, copper, silver, and gold in the imperial system were minted and circulated under the strict rules of weight, sizes, value, and metal composition. So the Roman currency had value all the time. And these coins were found all over the place, even across in India. The denarius was the silver coin, which was the main base of the Roman economy, and it was first struck in 211 BC, and it remained really solid for over 5 centuries. But later on, it was debased. It was mixed with, all sorts of impurities and bits chopped off here and clippings, as they were called, Roman clippings, and all sorts of impurities added, tin, lead, this, that, and the other. And the value of their coins just went down. And of course, this is what happens when you debase a currency. And the soldiers don't want to be paid in a rubbish currency, and they're not as morally bound to fight for you and expand your empire for you. So all sorts of disillusionment took place. And around 301 AD, Diocletian issued an edict of prices to save the economy. And, banning selling this, selling that. You couldn't sell your house. And it was an absolutely nonsensical edict with penalties of death if you broke the law. Just to give you an example, when Diocletian issued his edict, and there are copies that have been preserved, in 301 AD, the price of gold was 50,000 denarii per pound. We know from transaction receipts 50 years later that the price of gold had risen to 2.12 billion denarii per pound. In other words, the price of gold was 42,400 times greater 50 years after the edict. And that is called hyperinflation. And it's probably the first historical documented case of hyperinflation in the ancient world. So to put this in perspective, we need to see the impact of this in the purchasing power for a citizen. In the modern age, if an average new car sold for about 2,050 years ago, the average car today would sell for 85 million. That's what Diocletian did to the poor Romans. So next slide, the world of conquerors and prophets. How am I doing for time? So, okay. I'm going to rush through some of these. So it just gives you a flavor, and you just have to listen to the programs, I'm afraid, because I do want to leave a good time for questions. So, as I say, empires have come and gone. Great religious figures and teachers have come and gone. You know that from the study and of history of religion as well. But it'd be interesting to see, comparison, because we know so much about the Romans and also about Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Let's just explore what differences a religion can make in terms of how we deal with our fellow human beings and economy and etc. So the Roman Empire obviously was ruling the whole of Mediterranean, the part of Israel, Levant, Egypt, etc. And of course, that was the time when the Jews were expecting the arrival of the great Messiah to save them and free them. Now, they expected, obviously, a military Messiah. And guess what? Jesus, son of Mary, came as the Messiah, and he said, blessed are the poor, and, blessed are the peacemakers and all that. And the Jews didn't like it because he was too peaceful. The Jews also reported on him as another king and who could challenge Caesar, and that was just to get him in trouble. And that's when he gave this statement, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God, because the Pharisees were trying to get him in trouble, and he gave a very beautiful answer to people as well. But of course, the Romans wanted to keep the peace, and the Jews were in majority, so they listened to them and got him crucified, unfortunately. Even though Jesus' teaching was beautiful in every way, but he was not the military leader. But as it turned out, he had a few companions, a few disciples, as we say, and they went and continued to spread this message. Of course, there's a whole difference of view of what happened to him at crucifixion and afterwards as well. But those disciples who then spread, especially through St. Paul's version of Christianity, started gaining ground. And of course, early Christians, were persecuted very badly by the Romans, but eventually they got through. And it took nearly 300 years to the time of Constantine, around 300. In fact, Constantine the First was 274 to 337 AD, and that's when he started adapting much more Christian way, and the Christians helped him defeat his competitor, and he accepted, or he didn't accept straight away then, but it made Christianity a major religion, and later on, of course, it became a straight religion through his successors, and Christianity eventually took over the whole of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was split into the Eastern Empire, where the base was Constantinople in Turkey, as we know, more modern Turkey, and then Rome as it remained. And the western part of Rome fell apart under the attack of the Germanic tribes, the Goths, and the Eastern Byzantine Empire, of course, remained for a long time. But of course, later on, the pressure from the Seljuk Turks and then the Ottoman Turks, started fading, and we'll deal with that under the rise of Islam. So in 410, Alaric, the Goths took Rome, and Rome was no more. And the Goths were then chased out from that part of the world, Rome, etc., by the Huns, Attila the Hun and his successors. And those Goths that moved to the west became known as Visigoths, and those that remained in the east were Eastern Goths. And the Visigoths, of course, were the ones that the Muslims had to encounter. So they were mixed with Iberian people of that time, from the Roman time and the Greek times, etc., and also the Germanic tribes known as the Visigoths. And the Muslims, of course, were very diplomatic in what they did and who they protected and how they expanded. And they had a 700-year rule in Spain, as most of you know. So just a quick one, of course, we had the arrival of Islam, starting with the Holy Quran being revealed in 610 to the Holy Prophet of Islam, who was born in 570. And he was, of course, a descendant of Ishmael, the other son of Abraham. So you can see the linkage from Abraham's progeny playing a major part. And the Holy Quran was completed in 632. And, the Muslims obviously took the Holy Quran's teaching to heart and the example of the Prophet of Islam. And during the righteous caliphs, the four caliphs, Hazrat Abu Bakr, Hazrat Umar, Hazrat Usman, Hazrat Ali Raziyallahu anhu, all of them, within about 30-year period, they had conquered the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire covering up to borders of Turkey, etc., up to Egypt, North Africa. It was just one of the most amazing expansions in human history. In fact, I'll just read a quote from Max de Monte in his History of the World. He writes, in the 6th century, the Arabs were desert nomads. In the 7th century, they were conquerors on the march. In the 8th century, they were masters of an empire that made the Mediterranean a Mohammedan lake. And in the 9th century, they were the standard bearers of a dazzling civilization, leaders in art, architecture, and science, while Western Europe was sinking deeper and deeper into a dark morass of their own making. So it was a great civilization. I'm going to rush through this. The next slide, Shakil, because you can study these. I wish I had more time. So this bit basically is this chapter is very important, and I hope listeners will follow this in a lot more detail. I haven't got that much. It's just to show why the importance of the zero changed the world in a bigger way than almost anything else, and that was due to the Arabs. And this slide and this chapter basically starts off by showing that none of the civilizations prior to the Muslims had properly used the zero. The Egyptians, through their hieroglyphics, used all sorts of shapes and numbers and whatever, but you could not count and represent a number easily. The Sumerians, again, and the Babylonians has a sort of a numbering system that went 1 to 60 or 59, whereas the Egyptians had 1 to 10 system. So and then the Romans, as you see on the right hand side in yellow, had a really funny system of writing, from 1 to 5, and then a 4 with having 1 in front, and a 6 with having 1 in front after 5, and it was really complicated. And try multiplying with that, it was almost impossible. And the Mayans in South America also had a very interesting system as well, with a zero actually before anybody else, but they didn't use it the way the Arabs were able to use it. So if you look at that, the bottom bit of that slide, it just shows in the Romans, if you had to write a number, my screen is too small to see, but there's a number, and if you write it in Roman numerals, you write, CC and X and L and M and all sorts, whereas the Arab numerals used, the sort of the unit, 10, hundreds, thousands, 10,000, 100,000, etc. So it was so easy to write a number and then do multiplications. So you have to follow this chapter in detail because it just shows. And whilst the Indians, actually, it was called the Indian numeral, and in Europe it became known as Arab Hindu Indian numeral, but it was Khwarizmi who basically introduced it, and Al-Kindi also, with the book later on, introduced it in a big way. But he used the zero both in terms of placement as well, and the decimal point as well. Next slide, Shakil. Next slide. Okay, so this basically, this sort of covers the part 4 of the program. So Islamic civilization, which is a bridge between the East and the West. As I mentioned, Khwarizmi's contribution is outstanding in what he was able to do, and it was Fibonacci in the 1200 and something who introduced it to Europe. You can imagine much later on, whereas Khwarizmi was there in 600 and something when he was initially introducing it, AD. So another, and there were so many great figures you've seen in my other programs covered as well for the Muslim world. But another important mention is Ibn Khaldun, who was an economist, a historian, a sociologist, father of almost everything, to be honest, for the modern world in many respects. He put forward theories that were 400 years earlier than Adam Smith, the so-called founder of capitalism from Scotland. And even President Reagan, quoted him recently, and one of the professors from America quotes him as one of the greatest economists and sociologists of all time as well. So, people like him made great contributions. But of course, after the great Arab empires, you had split between the Ottomans. Of course, in between the Seljuks and many others as well. But the great Ottoman Empire, mighty empire that dominated a lot of Europe and much of Asia. The Safavid empires, where the 12 Shia Islam became established, and again, the cities like Isfahan, etc., which are wonders of the world with beautiful architecture and art and everything else. And then, of course, the great Mughal dynasty of India. And again, there's a whole series of programs on these. I haven't got time to go through them in detail. And on the Chinese, of course, you had the Ming dynasty. The Tang dynasty was also there before them. And the Tang dynasty was sort of equivalent to the Abbasid dynasty. And, really, the Abbasids were mighty rulers that controlled the Silk Road. But they developed good relationship in time with the Tang. And they were the only ones that could give the Tang a major defeat at one of the wars. But the Tang were very appreciative of what the Muslims were able to contribute. And during the Ming dynasty, majority of the big generals of the emperors were Muslims as well. And also the greatest admiral and seafarer and the greatest armada across the Pacific and the African and Indian continents, was led by a Muslim admiral as well. So that's something to be amazed by. And of course, the Ming were taken over by the Song, and the Song in turn by the Yuan, Mongol Yuan. And at one stage, the Mongol Yuan dynasty stretched all the way up to Russia. But of course, later the Mongol Empire split into four, and the Yuan dynasty was largely around China, and that was then replaced later on by the Ming dynasty as well. So after basically the Tang dynasty, in fact, was the Song. The Song were replaced by the Yuan, the Mongols, and the Mongols were replaced by the Ming, and then the Qing finally, and then the Europeans came over. Next slide, please. And again, there's the whole story of currencies. Oh, by the way, and during that period, I told you about the silver coins. Guess who were the first to introduce banknotes? It was the Chinese under the Song dynasty. So the Song dynasty actually introduced the banknotes, but it was the Mongol Yuan dynasty which made them widespread across whole of China and the whole of their empire. And then, of course, Marco Polo and others picked up on that, and banknotes started developing elsewhere as well. And of course, the Muslim world used a lot of the technology from the Chinese they picked up as well. But of course, during the Muslim empires, one of the key things was no interest could be charged to anybody. And of course, you had to develop through use of zakat. And jizya for non-believers as well was used as a tax to develop the nationhood and the welfare state, etc. But there were so many rights given to non-believers as well. So that's another story. But the economy was amazing because within a few years, Baghdad became the most prosperous city in the whole of the world. And of course, there were places like Damascus and many other cities, including Cordoba and in the Central Asian republics as well. So they were great economists as well, the contributing to the development. So, making of the European Empire, well, this is basically when Europe took over the world, and you're going to have to follow the programs because there's not much time left, but these slides just sum up how India was subjugated by the Europeans. And when the Turks obviously took over Constantinople, the Europeans were forced to find sea routes. And that was a blessing for the Europeans, especially the Portuguese and the Spanish, who became the first two empires because they developed navigation, great big ships, and they went to Americas and India and had half of the world split between them. And the Pope actually gave them the right to split up the world because other European powers were small. Charlemagne, as the sort of king that unified Europe early on, was around 800 AD, etc. So that was the early stage where the Frankish were playing a part in re-establishing Europe. But after that, it was the Spanish kings, especially Charles V and his son Philip II, who became the dominant rulers, and they controlled whole of Europe. And then, of course, the Reformation started with Protestantism and going against the Pope and the split between Dutch Protestant powers, and then the English became as well, and the Germans, and all long story. But ultimately, Industrial Revolution and Enlightenment just allowed the European powers to be superior at everything, including finally the Chinese, who they doped with opium, I'm afraid. So that's a very bad chapter in human history. But they did eventually take over China as well. They didn't rule them as India was ruled by the British, but China was, split between different European powers. But of course, later on, rivalries started developing between European powers, especially with the Germans rising. At one stage, Napoleon, of course, gave Britain a good run for its money, but he was eventually defeated. But the Germans eventually rose, and as they were expected to. And the Russians, of course, played a big part in the big game. So there's a whole bit to be covered on that as well. But the rivalries led to, let's have the next slide, and we're coming towards the end. Oh gosh, I wanted some question time, but go on quick. So this is basically, this chapter covers the clash of capitalism and communism, covers the two world wars, what led to them, what happened to them, how the European economies were thrashed. America became the dominant power. China regained its self-confidence and independence and unity, as did India got its independence, and many other nations as well. And of course, how it led to the Cold War between the capitalist world and the communists, and how the Americans did a clever one by doing a deal with the Saudis to have the dollar reinforced, even though it went off the gold standard and become a useless currency. But because they linked it to the oil and petrodollar, it kept it going for many, many more decades and kept its strength. And now we're facing a new challenge. Last slide, because let's see if we can get something in. This is basically the new world that we're seeing shaping in front of us. So you saw the collapse of communism, what led to that, the Gulf Wars 1 and 2, rise of terrorism as expected and predicted, the destruction of Middle East and the Muslim heritage in many ways with Baghdad. You can see it being bombed to bits. And of course, throughout all this, you had rising powers, China gaining confidence, and economy is becoming stronger and stronger. And now you've got the battle between the Americans and the Chinese in terms of who's going to rule the world, and time will tell. But in all this, there is, of course, another person who says what's going to happen to the world, and that's not person, but there is God who says what will happen, and that's through a person, his chosen person, a prophet of God. And the Messiah, second coming of it, we talk about in the Judeo-Christian traditions. As Ahmadis believe he has come, and again, he has shown what will happen to the world, how the world will be reformed, changed, and how Islam will play a part again, and inshallah through Ahmadiyyat. So that's a whistle. You're going to have to listen to the programs, but I'm sorry if I haven't left enough time for questions.
Hi, Dr. Zahid. Go on, Kamal sir.
Jazakallah, Dr. Sahib. I mean, personally, I could go on. Unfortunately, thing is the fact that we are bound by time. This is a very relevant lecture, and you have done extreme justice to it. And we are most grateful for what you have shared with us today of your intellectual capabilities, and may Allah bless you immensely for that. Inshallah, we hope that in later time you will have time to come and dissect, particularly into certain areas coming towards the end, where we would have time to very much, share from your expertise and knowledge. May Allah bless you. I would hand over to Shakil Saab. I think there are some few questions which we would be very happy to hear your responses on.
Right, Jazakallah. Dr. Saab, I think I'm just going to echo what Kamal Saab has said about the whole lecture. There are comments here which were quite good. So I'm just going to quickly, if you're okay with answering a couple of questions here, just making sure that we'll take the opportunity. You've alluded to the some of the numeracy earlier on. So is there a way you could explain the dating system and how the correlates to today's date? So for example, 120 BCE in relation to now, is that something?
So basically, in the old days, we used to use BC and AD, and sometimes they say before the Christian era or the Common Era. So basically, it's based on the Christian calendar scope after Christ and before that. That's all. So, but the numbers are relevant.
Okay. There's another question we have, talking about towards the end, you talked about the religious aspect of things, but in particularly for the Islamic system. So how does the Islamic system addresses the consistence of this inflation, money losing value over money time, since interest is haram? So how does that work? Because you talked about no interest as well, didn't you, in a bit?
Well, I have friends in high places within the Ahmadi community as well, and they haven't given me a full answer, so I will be the last person as a scientist to give you an answer. It's a very complex area, but what Islam forbids absolutely totally is the whole charging of interest. And early Christianity did as well, and that's why only the Jews were allowed to actually give the lending of the money, and therefore the Jewish bankers became the major players until Christianity changed its rules. So it's an issue, and inflation is related to management really of the economy, but interest is about greed and accumulation and misuse. And from a religious point of view, God is absolutely clear that sovereignty is God's. After that, you're only there to do justice and fairness, and using interest is a terrible way of really showing greed and really expanding inequality amongst people. So zakat is fixed for individuals to help the needy, as are other taxes.
Okay, Jazakallah. Once again, Jazakallah, Dr. Sahib, for your comprehensive lecture. It's quite knowledgeable. There's lots to dissect and digest on this whole topic. So, as Kamal Sahib said, you might be invited. I'm sure we will be invited again to go further on this. So, I just want to thank our viewers. Please continue watching these lectures. As you know, Monday is always the Urdu lecture, and Tuesday is the English lecture. Any feedback on the email given below on the screen there, taleemonline@ahmadiyyauk.org, would be appreciated. At this stage, I would like our speaker guest to lead us in the silence prayer, please.
Please join me. Bismillah. Ameen.
Amen.
Amen. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.